The War and the Nigerian Intellectual. The war came as a surprise to the vast majority of artists and intellectuals on both sides of the conflict. We had not realized just how fragile, even weak, Nigeria was as a nation. Only a few Nigerians, such as the poet Christopher Okigbo, had early and privileged insight into the Nigerian-Biafran crisis. We, the intellectuals, were deeply disillusioned by the ineptitude of Nigeria's ruling elite and by what we saw taking place in our young nation. As far as their relationship with the masses was concerned, Nigerian politicians, we felt, had slowly transformed themselves into the personification of Aun, the wasp, a notorious predator from the insect kingdom. Wasps African children learn during story time greets unsuspecting prey with a painful, paralyzing sting, then lay eggs on their body, which then proceed to eat the victim alive. Intellectuals had other reasons to despair. We were especially disheartened by the disintegration of the state because we were brought up in the belief that we were destined to rule. Our northern Nigerian brethren had similar sentiments, but those feelings came from a totally different understanding of the world. This opinion may explain why so many intellectuals played an active role in various capacities during the war years. Some of us evolved into public intellectuals through the period of the national crisis leading up to the war and exposed distortions and misrepresentations within the political system. Once the war began, however, many, particularly those of us in Biafra, drew upon the teachings of our ancient traditions. Nri philosophy implores intellectuals to transform themselves into warriors of peace during periods of crisis, with a proclivity for action over rhetoric. Many of our finest writers and thinkers were armed with this ancient wisdom and worked towards a peaceful resolution to the hostilities. Cyprian Ekwensi was one of the pioneers of the West African literary renaissance of the 20th century. He was the author of numerous works such as An African Night's Entertainment, The Passport of Malam Ilia, Burning Grass, The Drummer Boy, and Jaguar Nana. When the war broke out, Ekwensi left his job as director of the Nigerian Ministry of Information and served the Biafran cause in the Bureau of External Publicity and as a roving ambassador for the people of the enclave. During the war years, I traveled with Ekwensi and Gabriel Okara on several diplomatic voyages on behalf of the people of Biafra. Wole Soyinka was already regarded by this time as Africa's foremost dramatist. He had published The Swamp Dweller, The Lion and the Jewel, and The Trials of Brother Jero, as well as collections of poetry. The Road is considered by many to be his greatest play. A Dance of the Forest, a biting criticism of Nigeria's ruling classes, was the first of what was to become his signature role as one of the most consistent critics of misrule from his generation. His 1964 novel, The Interpreters, as well as ventures into recording film and poetry, showcased his versatility. Soyinka's attempt to avert a full-blown civil war by meeting with Colonel Ojukwu and Victor Banjo, as well as with the Lieutenant Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, would earn him enemies in the Nigerian federal government and a 22-month imprisonment. The story I was told about this incident was that Wole, fed up with the federal government's unsuccessful treatment of the Biafran issue, had traveled to secessionist Biafra in an attempt to appeal for a ceasefire to the hostilities. He planned to set up an anti-war delegation made up of intellectuals, artists, and writers from both sides of the conflict and from around the world to achieve his aim. When he returned to Nigeria, the authorities arrested him and accused him of assisting Biafra in the purchase of weapons of war. There was no evidence to corroborate their case, and Wole was imprisoned without bail. Later, to justify holding him without evidence, the federal government accused Wole of being a Biafran agent or spy, trumped up charges that he categorically denied. I remember relating my discourse about Soyinka's predicament to the editors of Transition in 1968 during the war. I have no intention of being placed in a Nigerian situation at all. I find it intolerable. I find the Nigerian situation untenable. If I had been a Nigerian, I think I would have been in the same situation as Wole Soyinka is, in prison. There was great concern for Wole's health and safety as time went on. For many of the months he was in prison, he was held in solitary confinement and moved from one prison to another. Most of us in Biafra were appalled. Penn International and many major writers of the time, Norman Mailer comes to mind, led a vigorous protest on his behalf, but he was not released until close to the very end of the war. Professor Kenneth Onwokadike inspired us all very greatly and deserves special attention. He was a pioneer in so many respects. He was one of the first pupils to attend Dennis Memorial Grammar School. After that, he traveled to the Gold Coast to attend Achimota College and then went farther afield in Sierra Leone to attend Fura Bay College before proceeding to England for undergraduate studies. He received his Bachelor of Science degree at the Durham University, England, and his Master of Arts degree from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. After a few years of study at Oxford, he earned his PhD in history from the University of London and returned to Nigeria, first to join the faculty, but later to become the first indigenous vice-chancellor of University College, Ibadan. In the late 1960s, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations decided to set up the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture somewhere in Nigeria, under the leadership of the former president of North Dakota State University, Fargo, Dr. Herbert R. Albrecht. DK, along with Dr. T.A. Lambo, were among the Nigerians consulted. DK suggested the prestigious institution be founded on a 2,300-acre campus in a loose affiliation with the University College Ibadan. And so it was. DK was involved in several of these kinds of projects. For example, he was also instrumental in the establishment of the Nigerian National Archives. Everyone who knew him will acknowledge that DK was one of the most detribalized Nigerians of his generation. This point requires emphasis. A man of this ilk, a rare breed indeed, watched horrified at the disintegration of the nation that he and so many others had fought to establish. His sentiments would change to despair and anger following the massacre of 30,000 Easterners and the rising hostility towards him and his family in Ibadan. DK resigned as Vice-Chancellor of Ibadan in December 1966 and returned to eastern Nigeria, where he served as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Biafra for a brief period. When the war broke out, DK was appointed by Ojukwu to be a roving ambassador for Biafra. He and other roving ambassadors traveled extensively throughout the world, speaking on behalf of the secessionist republic. DK was particularly effective in this role, and his appearances attracted vigorous media attention. I remember reading several articles in the Washington Post following his appearance at the National Press Club. One article in particular, called Biafran Explains Its Case and published on April 13, 1969, was especially influential. Before our time, DK had already established an international reputation for academic excellence as a historian. He taught at Harvard University after the war as the first Mellon Professor of African History. In 1978, At the dawn of Nigeria's Second Republic, this towering international academic returned to Nigeria to help set up the Anambra State University of Technology, ASUTEC. It is a disservice to this wonderful man, to his achievements and contribution to Nigeria's development, that he died in 1983 from a blood infection that would not have been difficult to cure had he stayed in the United States. Vincent Chukwuemeka Ike also supported the Biafran cause and served the Biafran people in several bureaucratic positions. Later, through prolific literary output, Ike took a well-deserved place at the vanguard of the continent's leading novelist. The literary harvest from Africa today owes a great debt to female African intellectual forerunners. These griots, orators, and later writers played an indispensable role in recording, molding, and transmitting the African story. By boldly mixing numerous African and Western literary traditions in a cauldron, seasoning them with local color, and spicing their tales with the complexity of the human condition, modern women wordsmiths have deepened our understanding of our world. Florence Nwazuraho Nwapa, Flora Nwapa, belongs to this important school of African female literary progenitors. 5 years before the war in 1962, Flora Nwapa informed me that she was working on a manuscript to be called Efuru. After some editorial work, Efuru was published in 1966, on the eve of the war, to great fanfare. It was a monumental event, as it was, as far as I could tell, the first novel published by a Nigerian woman. It was also important because it was a book ahead of its time, with an assuredly feminist plot and perspective. Around the same period, as Providence would have it, Alan Hill, the publishing executive at Heinemann Publishers in England, asked me to become the first editor of the African Writers series. Alan and I, with James Curry and a few others, developed a vision of gathering much of Africa's literary talent under this series rubric in order to showcase the best of post-colonial African literature. We had a fascinating beginning and ended up publishing Christopher Okigbo from Nigeria, Ahikwe Ama from Ghana, Al-Tahib Salih from Sudan, Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, Bessie Head from Botswana, Nadine Godima from South Africa, and Nelson Mandela, along with several other major African writers. Flora Nwapa aided the Biafran war efforts in various capacities, and after the conflict was over, continued her service to her people in the Ministry of Health and Social Welfare, the Ministry of Lands, Survey and Urban Development, and the Ministry of Establishments. She is remembered for her bold effort at reconstructing many institutions that had been destroyed during the Biafran War. It is important to point out that a number of writers were neutral and quietly, as far as I could tell, apolitical during the conflict between Nigeria and Biafra. They did not align themselves with or provide overt support to either belligerent during the war. One such individual was Amos Tutuola, who was a talented writer. His most famous novels, The Palm Wine Drinkard, published in 1946, and My Life in the Bush of Ghosts in 1954, explore Yoruba traditions and folklore. He received a great deal of criticism from Nigerian literary critics for his use of broken or pidgin English. Luckily for all of us, Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet and writer, was enthralled by Tutuola's bewitching literary prose and wrote glowing reviews that helped Tutuola's work attain international acclaim. I still believe that Tutuola's critics in Nigeria missed the point. The beauty of his tales was fantastical expression of a form of an indigenous Yoruba therefore African magical realism. It is important to note that his books came out several decades before the brilliant Gabriel Garcia Marquez published his own masterpieces of Latin American literature, such as 100 Years of Solitude. I first met Mabel Shegun, ne Aug Imokwede, another prominent literary figure who was in the second set of students admitted to University College Ibadan around 1949. She was a bright and energetic student from Shabondiga Ora in Edo State. I was the editor of the university paper, the University Herald, and when it came time to appoint a deputy editor and advertisement manager, she was a natural choice. In 1965, African University Press, a formidable outfit at the time, published her children's book, My Father's Daughter. Bolanle Awe, Dr. Tai Solarin, S.J. Koki, Gabriel Okara, Ola Rotimi, Ade Ajayi, and Emmanuel Obiechina were all the towering figures of that era who I admired.